Jinx. Hills Lake. The name even sounds like something out of a slasher movie. Ask anyone in my hometown and chances are they either are or at least know someone who will not drive down Hills Lake Road at night. The whole 500 or more acre place looks like the beginning of Tales from the Dark Side, you know, when everything turns to a film negative and that spooky voice says, a dark side. The bent and twisted trees with vines hanging off of them like entrails resemble something torn off the cover of an H.P. Lovecraft cover, I shit you not. It'll make your hair stand on end during the day, much less the fright it will send through your spine viewing it at night. And everyone who's been there has a story. Our town has a local witch. Not an old woman who lives alone, and the kids all say she bites the heads off of chickens at night, though they do say that, but a pagan or Wiccan, or something along those lines, who had the misfortune to move to this small, Texas, redneck town back in the 60s. She's apparently been married half a dozen times, and her husbands have the nasty habit of disappearing suddenly. Investigations are always had, but she's never been implicated, and people say her husbands are all lying at the bottom of Hills Lake. In fact, if even half of the stories are true, there are quite a lot of bodies at the bottom of Hills Lake. Back in the 50s, when desegregation was still a hot topic, and the Klan was at the height of its activity in Texas, barely a month went by without some poor black man or woman being found hung from one of the trees at Hills Lake. Over the years there must have been at least 100 or more blacks hung from the trees in the woods surrounding Hills Lake by some Klan assholes for some imagined offense. People say maybe that's why the place has such bad juju, along with 100 or so other bodies rumored to be at the bottom. My uncle used to fish there, and said the fishing was good, but he couldn't stand the snakes. The omnipresent, stealthy, superfluous snakes. In the water, in the trees. He liked to fish in the shade, but he'd have to take a stick and knock at least a dozen snakes out of any limb he tried to fish under, then wait for the water to settle again so the fish would bite, all the while hoping that more snakes wouldn't climb into the tree and fall into his boat. He had to give up fishing there, eventually. When my friend Jason and his wife were first dating, back around 1995, he took her to Hills Lake late one night to make out. It was a mistake. Every time they'd get hot and heavy, he'd hear some weird noise from just outside the car, or something would bump against the car, which was 30 feet from the trees in a clearing beside the bank, and it ended in them both being put off sex for the night. Instead, they decided to just sit in the romantic moonlight with the windows rolled down next to the lake. After rolling the windows down, the noises got louder and stranger, and Jason couldn't quite identify them. They were getting nervous, and the sounds were getting more frightening, when Jason thought he saw something moving in the trees. It looked human, but short, and something didn't seem quite right about it. At first he believed it was some friends playing a joke on him and his girlfriend, until he saw it again. Two of them. Shadows in the trees that looked like two short people covered in fur. Jason decided to get them the hell out of there, and turned the ignition key to find the car wouldn't start. Of course. His girl was freaking out by now and pleading with him to stop fucking around and get the car cranked, so he slammed his foot on the pedal, turned the key over and over, everything he could think of. Nothing. Then came the noise. He said it sounded like it was a mile away, and loud. He couldn't really describe it so well, but the best he could manage was that it sounded like twisting metal mixed with an animal's howl. At this point, he officially freaked out and screamed at the dashboard start, "You motherfucker," turned the key, and the car miraculously cranked. He saw more of the short furries moving in the trees and hit the gas, getting ready to run over one if it ran toward them. On their way out, they heard the metal animal scream again, and floored the pedal to get as far the hell away as possible. Jason said he might go with me back to Hills Lake to check it out again someday, but that he's carrying a Bible and a crucifix with him if we do. His wife goes pale at the mention and won't even talk about it. She left the room to go check on their daughter when he told me this story, and wouldn't come back until he assured her he was done. Hills Lake also has its own prowling ghost, called the Haint. A walking disembodied shadow that chases unlucky explorers through the creepy woods surrounding the place. I've heard a few stories, But the best one is also the only first-hand account I have. Pedro was a Mexican Indian, big, bad, ex-member of the Bandidos, a much-feared southern biker gang. At 35, he was still a strong, large, tough bastard known for drinking and getting into fights on the weekends to let off steam after working in construction during the week. One weekend night, he decided to go fishing with my uncle and another friend on Hills Lake, and they decided to stay the night in a small cabin my uncle knew about. So after a frustratingly uneventful evening of fishing and a night of drinking a little beer, Pedro got in an argument with his two friends, and getting mad, decided to cool off walking the few miles back to town and home, slinging his hunting rifle over his shoulder and leaving. My uncle got a little worried when he heard the first rifle shot 20 minutes after Pedro left, and the second a minute later. But what really worried him was the repeated shots he heard, and a few minutes later when he heard the screaming in Spanish, the door flew open, and Pedro ran inside, face pale as a white man's, and locked himself in the back room of the cabin, not coming out to tell the tale until morning. Here's what he told me happened, which jives with what my uncle told me. After leaving the cabin, Pedro walked down the hard dirt road in the cold night air, thinking of nothing but getting home and going to sleep. After a mile or so, he came to an old, rotten, wooden fence about 4 feet high, that intersected the road, and was falling apart. He didn't really even notice it until he saw a man's silhouette standing on the other side, watching him. Pedro slowed and waved to the man, to show that he wasn't there to cause trouble, just to walk on by on his way to town. The man just stood there, not waving back, so Pedro kept going, but kept one eye on him just in case. There were weird people out there, after all. After walking a few more steps, the silhouette started walking along the fence toward the road, as if to meet him. Pedro stopped, and the shadow stopped. He stood there for a moment, then started walking again, after which the guy started walking again. Stopping once more, causing the other guy to of course stop again, Pedro was a little wary and drew his rifle. Fearing he was about to be robbed, he decided to take no chances and fired a shot from the rifle into the air to scare the guy away. No response. The guy started slowly walking along the fence again toward the road ahead, so Pedro fired a second warning shot, at which point the shadow man walked through the fence and began running quickly toward Pedro. This, of course, scared the living fuck out of our Mexican Indian biker hero, and he ran in the opposite direction back to the cabin, firing his rifle blindly behind him, hearing the shadow man's footsteps behind him the whole way back until he reached the cabin and threw the door open. That's the way most of the stories go. The haint appears from out of nowhere in the woods and chases someone until they get to safety, or sometimes just until he gets bored with it. Some say they've seen him carrying a knife.